I introduced Kate and Blanchfield.
Thanks everyone for coming to this discussion and for the launch of Columbia in Manhattanville, which is over there in the corner. We'll look at it later. And thanks to the Offset Events for organizing this conversation, and of course to the speakers, to Amale, Andraos, to Reinhold Martin, Deborah Cullen-Morales, and Eric K. Washington, who will be having some very lively conversation in a couple minutes. And I'd also like to thank all of the contributors and Yoon-Jae Choi and Ken Meyer, who did a really stunning graphic design for the book. So Columbia in Manhattanville is a collection of essays, interviews, photographs, and historical episodes that together both chronicle and comment upon Columbia University's expansion in Harlem. Columbia in Manhattanville is also just that, a new campus only a few blocks north of here, the first two buildings for which will open next fall. So when putting this book together, we had a couple questions, like what are the relationship between these two? What role does publication have as a historical record of an over a decade-long process of negotiation, planning, and design for what will be a 17-acre campus? But how also can a book be a forum for institutional self-reflection and even critique? How might it open up a conversation for the relationship between the school and its site? And almost 2 years ago now, Renzo Piano came here to talk downstairs in Wood about this project. And initially we thought of the book as a transcript of that, as in part of our GSAPP transcript series. But quickly we realized that the transcript needed to be much thickened. The story of Manhattanville is one of the evolving role of the Urban University in 2016. But just as equally, it's created in a very specific urban history. It is a collection of buildings that respond to changes in technology and learning that are shaping the 21st century research university, as Wallach writes in his preface. But at the same time, the architecture of Manhattanville and its substantial master plan are equally reflections of how this slice of West Harlem has developed, including urban visions for it that date from the 1960s to the present, and the complex, much negotiated relationship between the community and the school. So this volume has really grown to include interviews with architects, with SOM, who is responsible for the master plan, with Tom Jessel and Carl Becker, with the School of the Arts and Mind-Brain Behavior Institute. We also have essays from Stephen Gregory in anthropology about protest. We have a personal essay from Maxine Griffith about her experience growing up in the neighborhood. So it's a really rich collection that includes a really beautiful set of motion photographs by Dr. Tom Harris. And so today I think that we'll hear a little bit about this relationship between the changing nature of urban research universities and the specificities of Manhattanville itself and the campus. So now I'll introduce our speakers. Amale Andraos is the Dean of Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, and the founder of Work AC. She has a brilliant introduction to the book that frames Manhattanville within the history, the modernist grid, as well as an interview with Robert Kasdan, the former executive vice president of Columbia. Also joined by Deborah Cullen-Morales, who is the director and chief curator of the Miriam and Ira D. Wallach Art Gallery, which will be moving into the Blanchfield Center, which is one of the two Renzo buildings opening in the fall. And before the Wallach, she was the director of curatorial programs at the Museo del Barrio. We're also joined by Reinhold Martin, who's professor of architecture at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, and the director of the Temple Queen Buell Center for the Study of American Architecture. He's written an essay that looks to the literal foundations of the buildings we see on campus through the subterranean systems of the master plan. And we're also lucky to be joined by Eric K. Washington, who is biography fellow at the CUNY Leon Levy Center for Biography, a fellow of the Columbia University Community Scholars Program, and importantly the author of Manhattanville, Old Harlem, West Harlem, a history of Manhattanville. All right, so I'll turn it over to Amale.
thank you everyone for coming, joining us today. I'll keep my words brief because I'm sort of more interested in the kind of overall conversation. But as Caitlin mentioned, it started about 2 years ago. And when I became dean, the question for me was, the schools never really looked at Manhattanville. We looked at, developments all around the world, and it seemed timely to kind of examine what Manhattanville represents in terms of urban intervention, but also in terms of the future of the kind of university campus and what it says about education. And so I had the pleasure to interview Renzo Piano, who, by the way, is very happy with the transcript. He was like very excited about the conversation, as well as Robert Kasdan, who really was one of the kind of leaders of the process, and it was very interesting for me to, we know how long these things take, and to register the kind of dips and the moments that when people thought, well, it's never going to happen, and then the moments when it did happen, and so to kind of register that turn. But for my essay in particular, the Manhattanville grid, I was particularly interested in trying to rethink a little bit in light of the sort of Renzo's embrace of the grid, right, to develop Manhattanville, something that is not a given, and the logic of, the sort of sense of openness and connectedness as a result of the kind of extending the urban grid within that site. And so the essay starts by remembering that the grid, of course, has always been a tool of colonization from the Roman times, and it's theorists such as Foucault really theorize the kind of level of control of power, etc., that the grid, the urban grid, embodies as it kind of deploys a sort of evenness within a territory and a kind of tabula rasa. But at the same time, of course, there is the other reading of the grid, and that complicates the relationship of form to what the form does, which is the Delirious New York's grid, which is that the grid allows ultimate freedom and individual expression, kind of the sort of the field equalizer does allow freedom in the kind of vertical dimension. And if you think about Mondrian's grids, and there's kind of a lot of that sort of more avant-garde. So it's not so obvious that you could take a kind of urban form and then declare that it does one thing or another, but rather how is that urban form used? And I think that for Renzo, obviously, and for SM to a certain extent, it's that latter, the freedom that the urban grid has allowed in terms of the Manhattan qualities of diversity, etc., that is that are being kind of channeled and embraced as this sort of way to stitch this urban campus within the urban around it. And the essay continues to kind of zoom into the first building, really, the MBVI, and how that grid, gets expressed in terms of the architecture of the building and plan, but more importantly, even in elevation, with this kind of incredible layering that Renzo does, kind of thickening the facade, but also allowing it to be completely sort of transparent. A transparency that I think it's fair to say Renzo is probably one of the most skilled architects at achieving such transparency. For me, they're kind of that's one of the most interesting aspects of the building, and the contrast, it's sort of between the solidity of the Lampest building and the kind of transparency of the MBVI is a kind of really interesting tension that gets created with this sort of little park in the middle. But I was interested also in exploring this question of transparency, which now is often used by architects to, kind of declare access and democracy, and et cetera, at a time when I think people like Reinhold Martin have pointed out, transparency is actually used also to do exactly the opposite, which is it's become some of the strongest fortresses of, if you think about residential towers, et cetera, et cetera. So again, it's not a given that transparency would produce transparency and access. For that, I was sort of interested in Hilary Sample, Professor Sample's book on maintenance, which is transparency also requires maintenance, and the architecture doesn't perform the community relation or this kind of aspect of exchange and engagement. It's actually what happens in the building, and the maintenance of that exchange is something that is something for the future as we continue to think about that master plan and shaping it for the future, and continue to do what, in fact, the programming is starting to do, which is having a kind of, I think, clinic for the community and having programming, etc. So the work starts now. Basically, is the essay is what the essay suggests. It doesn't stand on the shoulders of either the urban gesture or the architecture, but rather on the direction that we take to really, I think, ensure that the kind of idealist vision of this urban campus can really become real in terms of producing new knowledge that's accessible and available and serving everyone, and not just a kind of certain group. So it's, I guess, trying to move beyond the architecture and the urban gesture to kind of engage with the life of the buildings as really the needed connection with the city. And then lastly, I would say that it is interesting, nevertheless, to, I think, move beyond these kinds of either-or conditions, where, after all, it is a campus. It's not part of the city, and campuses are not, they are serving a higher purpose of education, and so I think that Manhattanville offers a very interesting in-between sort of status of being at once removed and connected, and at once engaged and autonomous, and that is, that is its complexity, and I think that is worth recognizing, that it needs to operate at all these levels, and that it's neither completely integrated nor completely separated. And I think that both the grid in plan and in sort of elevation allow it to go both ways and to maintain that tension, which I think is kind of really interesting. So that's my introduction.
Hi, I'm Deborah Cullen. I'm the Director-in-Chief Curator of the Wallach Art Gallery, and I'm going to be speaking about the Memphis Center for the Arts in particular, the Wallach Art Gallery, which I am the director. I'm not assuming any of you know about the Wallach Art Gallery. We're hard to find, but perhaps you do, bear with me. We've been for 30 years here on the historic campus in the Skimmerhorn Hall next door on the 8th floor. You see our mission on the screen. We do 3 particular projects. We have an endowment from the Wallach Family Foundation to do projects of the graduate students in Faculty of Art History, or projects that art history is interested in seeing happen at the gallery. We have worked with the contemporary artists of our campus, meaning the MFA students in particular, and we're broadening that to include the artists in our communities, however we might define that. We can talk about that. And we want to offer new scholarship on the university's collections, which are held by the libraries. So we have close relationships to all 3 of these departments, in particular, Art History, School of the Arts, and the libraries, but we are between and among them, and we like to work with other institute centers, populations, schools, etc. I said, established in 1986. We've been doing lots of exhibitions and programming, but I like to say that we've been quietly excellent on the 8th floor of Skimmerhawk Hall, and it's time to stop being quietly excellent. So as you know, we're moving. We're scheduled to open actually in April of 2017, and I'll talk very briefly at the end about our program too, so just you can see what we'll be doing and how we'll be articulating our mission through our programming. But I wanted to walk you very briefly through the building with the architect's renderings. You've seen some photographs. So, sorry, this is from other presentations, but I do the lobby will be a transparent glass box, and we'll have benches, not chairs, so not those orange chairs, but you know, sort of a very open, a flexible space, like any sort of museological or performance space that you go into, where the lobby can be used for different things, and also for giving information and receiving the public and students who might come in to do classes or attend events. The next floor up is the Katrina Bernstein screening room, where we will show film video. We have capacity to do 16mm, 35mm film video, very high, you know, high-end, nice projection that seats about close to 200 with fixed seating. The next level up will be a performance space, a flexible performance space with seating that can be brought out, moved, adjusted, and also a mezzanine around. As you've seen from the images, there's glass windows outward, so we can pull down the shades and have a, you know, sort of a black box. Or we can open the shades and interact with the urban environment if the performance so desires. I love these architects' renderings. The gallery, the next floor up will be the Wallach Art Gallery. It will be more than double the space we have now with 18-foot ceilings, which is quite a difference if you've been to the Wallach. I urge you to go now so you can really appreciate the difference if you haven't been. And also no fixed walls, a movable wall system, and again, windows that can be shaded down or open if the contemporary art so allows it. And the top floor, we're calling the Lantern. I guess in the beginning stages, Renzo called the whole building the Lantern, so we've decided to honor that by calling it now the top floor the Lantern, which has is exactly the same as the Wallach Art Gallery, except it has a very large skylight to the sky, as you can see. Again, with very flexible formation, open space that can see, again, probably close to 200 for educational, public programming, performances, talks, artist presentations, what have you. And can be used for contemporary art exhibition, which we will use for certainly the MFA thesis. So let me just tell you briefly about our programming. Let me go back. Let me say that I came here from the Museo del Barrio, as you know, to be part of this building. I've been in New York a long time, I won't tell you how long. And I have only worked in, you know, sort of neoclassical or literally industrial buildings. And it's always sort of a fight against the architecture to work with art and to work inside those spaces. So I thought what an incredible opportunity to be here in a new building space, purpose designed for fine arts, in a building that will have all this, you know, presenting going through it, and where we can work together in unison or not, if we so choose. And to be in this very interesting location. What I see is sort of like an alignment between Broadway and the campus, the historic Marisa Heights campus of Columbia, but also, much to my interest, 125th Street, you know, running all the way east to El Barrio, where, as you know, I worked for 15 years. So I'm really interested in how, being at the edge of the new campus, we can engage the students, but also the broader community, which is rich in arts, that we're joining all these institutions, such as, you know, Studio Museum is always the most obvious one, but there's also the Hispanic Society, Museo del Barrio, the CCCADI just opened on East 125th Street, the Caribbean Cultural Diaspora Institute, Sugar Hill Children's Museum of Art and Storytelling, also on 155th Street. We're sort of joining a sort of a plethora of institutions that we can interact with. So I think we're in a very interesting position on the campus, but at the edge. And I want to see how our programming can bring that forward. Outside of being just literally transparent, being literally engaging with all of our constituencies. So the first year really wants to articulate that in a very purposeful way. So as I said, we're opening with the MFA thesis, which used to happen at the Fisher Landau Center in Long Island City for, I think, 8 or 10 years or so. The gallery was never large enough to hold it, so now we will be able to hold it, which is fantastic. That's just a shot from a prior. a prior exhibition, but the MFA thesis, if you haven't gone, is a lot of contemporary art by all the MFA students who are here on campus, including film, video, performance, and other types of activities. So it should be a very active moment to sort of open at the end of the spring semester. Then we're going to go into an exhibition called Uptown. It's our first summer of programming. Campus classes will, for the most part, be over, but this will be a time when we can really engage the broader public. I've been doing studio visits for the last 2 years. It will be an exhibition of artists, both from the campus and the community, contemporary artists, emerging, mid-career, and sort of mature practitioners, we'll say. This is a great example. Sanford Biggers, he did a benefit print for us. He's a professor here at Columbia University, also with a studio here in Harlem. So there's a lot of nice intersection, and it's a great moment for us to really, put our money where our mouth is and serve the artists who are all around us. And hopefully this will be a triennial. I'd like to see this be a triennial where we have a means of continually serving, what I imagine might be a slightly changing population, but there'll always be artists and very diverse artists, and we'd like to be able to present them in our space. As well, we're also creating collaborations with a number of different institutions in the community to do cross-programming, to do co-hosted exhibitions, and to do performance events. And we'd really like to flow out onto our plaza, the hardscape, the small square in front of the building during the moment. We haven't finalized the list, but I'll be happy to release it as soon as it's finalized. Then in the fall, from September to December, we'll have Living in America, Frank Lloyd Wright, Harlem and Modern Housing, curated by the Buell Center, of who we'll be hearing from Reinhold very soon. This is an exhibition that is it's done in collaboration with the larger Frank Lloyd Wright exhibition being held at MoMA. As you know, Avery and MoMA co-acquired the Frank Lloyd Wright archives in 2012, and there was supposed to be a major exhibition 5 years out, and so we'll be getting time for that exhibition, and the Wallach always wanted to be part of that. So we've thought of this, Buell Center has thought of this fantastic way, I think, of sort of bringing together the history of Frank Lloyd Wright's sort of visionary ideas about public housing, visionary and problematic and whatever, but public housing that were developed at the same time as public housing in Harlem. So we're sort of bringing together two timelines that hadn't been thought of together and looking at how they were thinking about different things from different perspectives in sort of a large timeline. And then in the spring we'll have an exhibition called Closing Modernity, which is curated by our first postdoctoral scholar from the art history department with the support of the Ford Foundation. It's a Ph.D. dissertation that looked at the role of the Black female model in Western art from Manet's Olympia up through contemporary figures such as Nicolene Thomas. So all these works are confirmed loans, so I'm very excited. So we'll have works from by Manet, Basile, Matisse, Charles Alston, Lamar Bearden, Faith Ringgold. Sorry, I put captions on everything. Nicolene Thomas. It's going to be a really amazing show that I think is going to really change the scholarship. So that was just a little overview of what we'll be doing, because I'm speaking particularly from the gallery's perspective, but from my perspective, the idea to make the gallery serve both the campus and the community is an interesting but a very positive challenge that I'm looking forward to doing.
And next we'll be hearing from Eric.
Hi, good afternoon. Congrats to all of the contributors to the new book. And also especially thank you to GSAPP for inviting me to come here. It was indeed a studio project at GSAPP in 1997 that produced a document, rather hefty, 70 pages, preservation plan for Hamilton Heights, Manhattanville. And that document informed and inspired my own local history adventure, an adventure which resulted in my own book, Manhattanville, Old Heart of West Harlem, an exhibit at City College, and if any of you shop at the Fairway and go to West Harlem Pierce Park, the interpretive signage is installed there. Since the 19th century town of Manhattanville is nearly forgotten, I'll give a brief overview and show a montage of images. The overview is Manhattanville was established in 1806 on Manhattan's way Upper West Side, we didn't even use those terms then, around the current intersection of Broadway and 125th Street, At the time, it was called Bloomingdale Road and Manhattan Street. And it was 8 miles from the city, which was a healthy remove from the almost annual outbreaks of yellow fever downtown. Those who could afford it, for many, many years in the late 1700s, early 1800s, would come up here and establish country estates in what was then called the Harlem Heights. And in 1806, I think there was, as the city was growing, it seemed reasonable to just sort of plant roots and establish a town. And it was kind of a no-brainer situation where they were, because if you stand by the McDonald's at Broadway and 125th Street and you look toward the river, this is the first really clear break to the river between what we now call Morningside Heights and Washington Heights. From the very beginning, tradesmen and mechanics were encouraged to locate here, and the first priority, first order of business was to establish, to adapt the riverfront, specifically so that they could keep 300-ton vessels in safety. Subsequent riverfront development included the opening of the Harlem River Railroad in 1851. These tracks linked Manhattanville to the city downtown and to Albany upstate. Docks for riverboat excursions, a ferry house, recreation piers, public health piers, a floating bathhouse, and also in the early 20th century, early 30s, West Side Improvement, which sort of modified 13 miles of track, freight track, from Spuyten-Duyvil to Spring Street, which was considered the lifeline of Manhattan's food and milk supply. The town also bustled around. This is, you can see an early map from 1816, I'm sorry, 1806, superimposed with the 1811 Commissioner's Plan. The town also bustled around several inland industries, and they included a worsted mill, breweries, a paint factory. You can see here this veritable campus of industry, which was owned by Manhattanville's most well-known citizen and the mayor of the entire city, Daniel F. Tiemann, who was mayor in 1858 and 1859. It was also the center of several educational and charitable institutions. So even before Morningside Heights kind of took that crown, there were several institutions of higher learning in Manhattanville. Manhattanville College, which is now out of the city, Manhattan College, which is now in the Bronx. There was the Academic Scientific Society, which is now where McDonald's is, and others scattered around the area. And you can get an idea of the riverfront being built up with the ferry house at the top there. On the top left, Manhattanville was the site that was chosen or proposed to host two World's Fairs, one of them being the Columbian Exposition, when New Yorkers were very confident that it would be in New York and not elsewhere, and they were wrong. But they did get a big grant, like $150,000 grant from the city to build up the riverfront in anticipation of that. The 129th Street Recreation Pier, and you can see also the viaduct that had been built up, constructed in 1900. Here's the Recreation Pier. And Railroad Depot, which was visited by Lincoln when he was newly elected president, and then again in death as his funeral train went northward. The trolley lines which came through here. So the whole riverfront was a convergence of river traffic, surface traffic, and railroad traffic. This was the first crosstown line in New York City, the Harlem-Manhattanville line. And I should add that Harlem-Manhattanville, they were two distinct areas, although Manhattanville was never incorporated, it was always a part of Harlem, still is a part of Harlem. But it was so distinct in its own right that it was recognized as a town. And they were pretty much throughout the 19th century, always mentioned in the same breath, like Dallas-Fort Worth, Minneapolis-St. Paul, Sodom and Gomorrah. Twin cities. So, despite the fact that Manhattanville enjoyed 19th century prominence, the introduction of rapid transit with the opening of the subway in 1904 ushered it into 20th century obscurity. And this is the site where the Memphis Center will open up shortly. So, whether by images or discussion, I think a glance back at the half-forgotten Manhattanville reminds us of what our predecessors were made of. And maybe because we happen to be in the throes of a singular presidential election campaign, I think it also gives us an understanding of some things that are at stake for us today. Manhattanville citizens participated directly in the American Revolution, in the War of 1812, and in the Civil War. They were very active in campaigns and movements for anti-slavery. There was a huge Quaker population which was known for its anti-slavery sentiments and actions, black suffrage movement, and voter registration movements. From its earliest days, this old corner of New York was predicted to become a place of considerable consequence. And indeed, it contributed powerfully to the narrative of New York City's growth. So I thank you writers who contributed to the work that we're here for today, for heightening its blip once again on the Harlem radar. Thank you. If anyone, I always find, I should just add, it's very interesting because we were always speaking, newspapers were already eulogizing Manhattanville about this time a century ago. And I found in doing my book that there's still enough out there to kind of connect the dots to its other narrative that goes back in time. I often say that Manhattanville is much greater than the sum of Columbia's footprint. And I'm giving you a walking tour on Saturday, next Saturday the 12th. So anyone who's interested in sort of getting a feel of what's around, what frames the project that's going on now, should go to the Municipal Art Society site, mas.org. Thank you.
Hi. Well, okay, so there is quite a bit to talk about, and I think probably most of the talking we can do as a group. I'll limit what I have to say to summarizing more or less the points I tried to make in the small text that I contributed to the book, which are really twofold. I mean, they're very straightforward, and in that sense, intended to sort of enable a very specific and historically precise discussion about many of the political issues that have circulated around the site. I don't just mean, you know, the sort of ones that have involved Columbia and its neighbors, but the larger, we can even say, macro-political processes that of which this history, and really, you know, it is kind of amazing to see the sort of the layers of which this history has been, or remains a part, an important part. So the first is, let's just say, let's leave it with two things, right? One has to do with the architecture, like very specifically that with the architecture of these two buildings. But that's all we have right now. And the other has to do with the urbanism, and most specifically with what's underneath those two buildings. So if we can kind of go backwards and start with that basic idea of the master plan, which required, of course, eminent domain to be exercised and so on and so forth, hence many of the controversies. The sort of, in a way, the driver for this is arguably invisible now, which is the so-called bathtub that's underneath the buildings, which is basically an infrastructural sort of system, or kind of a system of systems underground, and at the moment is mostly to do with heating and cooling the buildings that exist, the parking garages and so on. I don't know, the trend does seem to keep changing. The swimming pool is projected. And this is very similar to the bathtub that's underneath ground zero. And I think it's actually worth comparing these two, even quickly, to realize that this is not just an isolated project. This is something that these are going on simultaneously, almost exactly simultaneously, in New York, and with some of the same actors. Most importantly, the firm of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. And Caitlin did a fantastic interview with some of the architects from that firm regarding the urbanism, mainly. And so I urge you to read that interview. I think it's quite revealing. I think you can argue, and I'm saying this as a specialist, so to speak, that in many ways SOM designed Manhattan. And the name Renzo Piano has been used, and the work of Renzo Piano, and the glass and the blue and all of that, has been used to to articulate something that, in a sense, had already been said, in effect, or made underground. And it's the title of my little essay is called "Made in Manhattanville," and it's this relation between saying things and making things, or let's say between discourse and objects, including buildings. That's what it's really about. So. And you'll read in Caitlin's interview, and I quoted some of these in my own text, a number of statements about the streets, about the grid, and about the, which is very familiar. We heard this right almost the first thing after 9/11 when the word rebuilding was announced. It was kind of repeated endlessly in order to kind of drum up enthusiasm for war. The first thing that were going to be rebuilt were streets. Didn't exactly happen that way, but that was a big part of the master planning downtown, and it was a big part, as you know, of the master planning uptown. We might want to ask ourselves, why? What's the big deal about streets? Well, there's a long history about it. This has to do with urban renewal and the demapping of streets, mostly in the 50s and 60s. So in some sense, this is a restoration project, a recovery maybe of some of that history. But I think it is something else going on, and this has to do with the way the word public is used frequently. It has been used in and around these kinds of discussions, not just here, but in these kinds of discussions. And that we can summarize as, in a sense, a rendering public, a kind of opening up, even making transparent, if you will, making available, in some sense, of one sort of space that is coupled with the actual or virtual, which is to say potential, privatization of other kinds of space. So I think what's really at stake in the urbanism of this project are not the streets. We can talk about them, they're fine, whatever, but the public space, these publicly owned lands specifically, that on which the public housing across the street, across Broadway, currently exists. That, to me, is one of the really important sites, the most important, both symbolically and actually, in terms of thinking the urbanism of this. That land is land that was demapped. Those are streets that have been demapped. The eminent domain was exercised in many of those kinds of large-scale housing projects, public housing projects, in order to produce these large complexes that, as you know, have a complicated and contested history. This is part of what we're going to try to explain in the exhibition that Deborah referenced. But the most important thing to remember now is that this public land is publicly owned land. Mayor Bloomberg, and now following him, having been backed into a corner, Mayor de Blasio, have both articulated plans for basically privatizing that land. Not necessarily that particular land, but land like that elsewhere in the city. So it's understandable why residents in public housing, including immigrant houses and Manhattanville houses, are concerned. And we could talk about that, but I think we should keep our eye on this sort of, as it were, to speak about the Battle of Harlem Heights, the battlefield. Right? This is what is being contested in this election. It's been contested over the last 8 years with healthcare, and many things. The relationship basically between states and markets, And in this case, actually, I do think Columbia can maybe play a leading role in effect defending the values of public land, publicly owned land, maybe a little bit more loudly than we have previously. But that's difficult. I know it's difficult because there are many interests at play and many things at stake. One of the things at stake, this is the contradiction that I think we're living. We live this all the time. Is that actually we, meaning we here in this university, need a certain amount of, a certain degree of closure, a kind of balance. Indeed, you could even say that if you ask the question, what is a university and how does this campus or any other one answer that question, what is a university? It inherently will answer that in the modern age with some kind of boundary problem. In other words, basically the university is a boundary problem, and so the announcement that there are no gates in Manhattanville recognizes that. It seems a rather anxious announcement. I'm not sure why it needs to be announced, but okay, I understand. But in fact, we need gates to do the work that we do. They may not need to be sort of like, wrought iron gates like we have, but there does need to be boundaries. In fact, that's why we have the admissions office, for example. That's why there are institutions like tenure. That's in order to protect something like the autonomy, what in old-fashioned language is called the autonomy of academic discourse, and specifically the freedom associated with academic discourse through dissent, especially. But not only to dissent, but simply to tell the truth. So that this is a kind of it's a little bit of a spatial paradox that all universities inhabit, and we can see our university inhabiting and navigating and negotiating it in particular ways, and maybe even in interesting ways. I don't think that the glass is the most interesting part of the problem. It's an answer to the question in many ways, and it's pretty well done. I actually think, for example, the blue is maybe more interesting. Pantone 290 for sports, it's 292, and so-called Columbia blue because it's a way of marking something. It's a way of designating things. It's something like the name Manhattanville, in a sense, that does two kinds of work, I think, also. It recalls this complicated history, but it also allows us not to say Harlem. Because if I can imagine if this book was titled Columbia in Harlem, it would sound a little more controversial. So maybe those days already passed, and it's almost like saying Columbia in Soho, I'm not sure. But architecture does this work all the time, and it does this work in very, very classically architectural ways, like the color, the choice of color, the kind of decisions that architects make all the time. I would have made different choices for me, and probably our students would have done things differently too. But that's not the point. The point is for us in this field, in the field that we live in, we work in here at GSAPP, to recognize that even the very small technical decisions that architects make are very frequently participants, not necessarily drivers or causes of these kinds of complicated relationships, but participants in them. And so in that sense, this type of discussion invites us to reflect on the specificity of what we do, like the choice of paint colors, in relationship to these rather large and contested questions. On that note, I'll just end with one other question. This is a very architectural question. Sort of like, why are there two of everything in this building, in these designs? There are two smokestacks. The most noticeable thing on the campus right now is the smokestacks, and then there are two little vents next to the thing, which I understand are temporary, next to Deborah's building. You can eventually get rid of vents, but and that's the signature of the architect. There's no doubt that is a kind of, that's not a functional decision. It may be somehow underwritten by a certain kind of functionality, but it's not inevitable. And what it signifies, and this is what I'm ending with, this is really what the article is about, is that the first task of the architect in this kind of situation is to make meaning. Right? In fact, the smokestacks refer to the old figure of the university as a knowledge factory, which was used as a critical slogan in the 60s. And so we have to be able to ask, what does it mean to make meaning on this campus under these conditions, under these circumstances? And what kind of work does that meaning do? And I will leave that open to discuss. So I think we can jump in. Yeah, is that right?
Hopefully, I mean, everyone can, it's a small room, so everyone can kind of hear me, right? Yeah, so thank you, all of you, for great presentations and for putting a lot of really, different perspectives about the building and about the site kind of on the table. And I guess one of the things that, and perhaps this is to be expected, that you can kind of trace through all of these is the question of transparency, right? From the transparency of glass, the grid, I guess the real sort of desires for kind of community transparency that you see in the gallery. To even then, I was also thinking, Eric, when you were discussing sort of the footprint of Columbia, there was like a different kind of transparency too. Like the university would like to be transparent, but then also that goes both ways. That means seeing the neighborhood as well. It kind of operates as seeing the university, but then also as understanding the community in which that university is placing itself. I guess this is a pretty broad question, but how do all of you see transparency operating literally, metaphorically, in the campus? And clearly you've seen like the representational isn't really enough. So yeah, what's that doing?
Well, I thought it was really, for me, although the architecture certainly can have a certain level of meaning, I'm still more interested in what happens after, what happens that kind of undoes whatever meaning, which happens all the time. And I was very, it's great to see the exhibitions and the kind of exhibitions. I mean, both the kind of the black figure in Western art, or Frank White, or I think the way we start to invest and program and invite it in, and that is where the real exchange and the kind of building something new and then tying back to history. So I'm the kind of architect who uses the power program to sort of work for or against whatever the initial architect gesture does. And so I thought the choice of the exhibitions are already saying a lot in terms of new possibilities.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it, like I said, it's wonderful to be in a new building, and I have my feelings about, especially Reinhold's wonderful article that you should all definitely read. But I have my own feelings about it. But it was kind of a done deal, and I'm very excited to be in a new space. But for me, it's about what are we going to do with it? So I mean, I only spoke about the gallery, but there's equally interesting programming going for the video, for the performing, and for the talk club, for the theater, the education program. So to me, it's like what are we going to do with this space now that we have it, and how we're going to make it living for our campus and also our broader community.
So transparency. So one other way to think about this campus as such is in terms of uptown, downtown, like your chart, is that it's actually in the middle. This class is of course highly rhetorical and all of that, but it's actually in the middle. It's not uptown per se for Columbia because it's in between two Columbia campuses. It's in between this campus and the medical center. Almost exclusively, this was very striking to me from the very beginning when piano and SOM references were to this campus. And so the transparency rhetorically cites this campus by being everything except brick and stone. So that, in other words, and this has been, folded into quite a lot of the terminology and the discussion around this. So they're sort of, I think, constructed as foils for one another. So in some degree, we have a mirror, and it's basically Columbia looking at itself. So I would suggest looking elsewhere sometimes, and in this case, actually, uptown, further uptown, to the other campus, which is a very interesting urban configuration that did not traffic in either transparency or the fortified opacity that we are familiar with here. Almost in an ad hoc fashion, and certainly if you did history of that, that's another story, that the way those buildings were assembled was not nearly as planned as either of these two. Nonetheless, you could argue that it constitutes a different kind of urbanity, perhaps even a more urban model for thinking of urban campus than this one or that one, in which the question of transparency wouldn't be irrelevant, but it would sort of dissipate. And so, it's not something that when we speak about cities, when our students design large urban complexes, we don't necessarily shout either transparency or opacity like 100 times in one sentence. It surely would be a factor. But it would seem to me that the complexity of urban life is never reducible to something so simple as a piece of glass. On the other hand, if that piece of glass is a mirror, then one should recognize it as such and maybe, shatter it. And it's too late for that now, but I do think that there have been some very good interventions. I think the Durham Studebaker building, for example, up there, is really quite good, urbanistic. And it's better than the piano building, if I can run. I'm allowed to do that.
I'm recording.
You're recording, I know. What grade should you give these things? We're the architecture school. Anyway, so the point is, I think we would agree that transparency as such would very, very rarely be a criterion by which we would judge the urban consequence, I'd say, of a large development.
I like the MBI, by the way.
Yeah,
I really do.
And it's important to note that those script videos also.
They do in the business school across the street.
For me, I find that it's like Renzo at his best. I really like the kind of straightforward quality of the building, and I think that he broke down the scale and the dialogue between the manifest and the MBI in terms of breaking down the scale of these blocks, which are consequences of the master plan, which are quite large, really starts to work. So I don't know. Yeah. So I mean,
I can't speak to the architectural transparency, but I think a few of us giggled, Deborah, when you were showing the interior and you had all these silhouetted figures, and you mentioned transparency just as that slide went up, because you could see through them. But in a way, it's a significant metaphor for me in terms of the history of the place. These new buildings, this new architecture, this new form that's steeped in all of these other personages like transparent ghosts. And I would love to think that it will always be, the streets will always be haunted, with its past, not in a bad way, but in a very sort of enriching way, and edifying way.
I guess another question, kind of speaking to the streets and also to your presentation of looking through all of these images, the understanding of this site, makes sense in a certain way. You see Manhattanville as this industrial space, and it's on the waterfront, and then in the late 50s and early 60s, that industry starts to decline a little bit, and so there's a kind of sense of land use or real estate where you understand how enough land to make a campus can kind of come to be. And this has a lot to do with them doing it as well. But then it's also very different than a lot of waterfront development that we might see in the city. And this kind of speaks to what Reinhold was saying about the role of the university in advocating for public land, or how the university can play a certain role here that maybe the private development definitely couldn't. And in putting together the book, we looked at a lot of these episodes throughout history, mainly from the 60s to the 80s of different plans. Manhattanville, and some were, wonderful community centers, some were, condos as well. So I guess my question is, so now kind of looking forward, because this is a campus that's going to enroll for the next, 10, 20 years, how can the university understand, with this kind of history in mind, how might the university understand its unfolding and its relationship to its site as something that is dynamic and could have these positive potentials, like advocating for public spaces, like how can we kind of continue to expand what it is that we think the university could be doing in relationship to its community?
Well, we had Amale Hudson give a great talk here as someone who hopefully will join the Manhattan program. But in terms of various universities' kind of relationship to the communities around, in terms of not so much necessarily spatial, but literally, I think, as MBVI is starting to do, in terms of providing services, or he was talking about what's happening at Berkeley in terms of employment, or these kinds of very important educational possibilities, and I think this kind of engagement, I think, as knowledge is increasingly shaping cities around the world, there's a kind of responsibility to the universities to their kind of urban footprint. And so I think that process is probably an ongoing process that can get built, over time. It's definitely something that's kind of evolving. But anyway, it was interesting that certain planners are starting to look at that relationship and what that that actual that exchange looks like. But the other, so for me, I'm more interested in that, building those relationships, than this notion that a campus should be open. I think your point of, it is a university, that it is bounded. It has to be bounded. So this self-consciousness maybe is, less interesting than the fact that this is just a university. So, to be a little bit less, to be more clear on one hand so that you can be clearer on the other, rather than be in the kind of ambiguity of transparency.
You want to say something? Yeah, to add. On the waterfront versus other kinds of space question, it's an interesting one, because it's quite true. This, not just that part of the West Side waterfront, pretty much the entire West Side waterfront has, in a variety of ways, not very ambitiously, but nonetheless does function as a shared space, a public space that has been really activated recently, and the kind of history development has contributed to that. But that's one reason I wanted to call it, I still will insist on calling attention to the other open space on the other side, around public housing. So one answer to this is, but there are many obviously, but not so much as a civic actor, but as an academic space, would be for the university to support and sustain a serious critique with serious alternatives to neoliberal economic development, because that's what we're talking about. So, in other words, by this I mean very simply, in this case, the privatization of public goods, in this case land. And so what it shows in a kind of local way is that certain kinds of public space can be funded, can be developed, can be gotten through review boards and all the rest of it, and others have a harder time. And the one that usually gets through is a park, or something like a park, because it's, and this is why streets are part of the story. They're on that side of the discussion. But public housing, you'll notice that public housing is never spoken of as such. It's always affordable housing. It's like affordable healthcare. It's, you know, affordable, of course, in the next question is not only affordable to whom, but the recognition. This is what we do in universities. We recognize that the use of words matters. And the use of the substitution of the word public with the word affordable is a very, very meaningful one. And it indexes the movement away from the logic of the civic, the polis, basically, the sort of civic body as a sort of complex of responsibilities that has traditionally in modern times been institutionalized in the state, but can surely be institutionalized in other ways, to that of markets, in which affordability, in other words, you know, can I afford or not afford something, is the governing form of reason. So, you know, and that's why that land, which is public land, but which is essentially being privatized slowly but surely, because NYCHA is basically going bankrupt, ought to be part of the conversation. And you know, literally, but also figuratively. In other words, all the values. It's quite clear, for example, that we have not, in this current election, been able to speak about something like a right to housing. We're getting there with other issues like healthcare, or education, but not necessarily housing. This is meaningful. This is a big change. This is a change from the last great moment in which Columbia, you know, sort of had a tough time dealing with its neighbors from the 60s, because and I think it's also part of our job to mark those changes as intellectuals who think historically. So that's really, you know, that's in a sense the flip side of this. There are many, many good things that the gentrification of New York has brought to those of us who can still afford to live here, and many of which are things like parks and highlights and, you know, these things. I mean, the museums and other cultural institutions. The tough stuff, though, is either kicked down the road or renamed or reframed in other ways to transform the political conversation.
We can also open it up. Does anyone have questions?
Do you want the architecture school to move to Manhattanville? This is my moment to, you can do it now.
If you're here, you can
my strategic plan. If you say no, you have to live with the space.
Why don't you go from 129 to 125?
What?
On Broadway, that's from 129 to 125, when you're talking about street grids.
What, the name?
Right, the street, 125th, on the west side of Broadway is 125th. The next block, north, is 129.
Okay.
Oh,
I can
yeah,
explain.
right.
Because in 1921, they determined to rename, they jettisoned the signature name street, Manhattan Street, which conformed to the topography because it's a valley.
Yeah.
So they decided to rename that and make it the oblique continuation of the grid 125th Street. So if you look on a map at 125th, it looks like somebody got a hold of it and just bent it upwards, you know.
Right.
That's because there were two separate streets from river to river. And once they renamed Manhattan Street 125th Street, then they had to change the numbers so that nobody would get confused. So the original 125th Street became La Salle. The original 126th Street became Moylan Place after somebody from the neighborhood had died in World War I. And now it's totally obliterated because subsequently they built the grand houses. But there's still a street sign that says Moylan Place. And 127th Street very appropriately became Tiemann Place because Tiemann's estate was there and his house is actually in the middle of the street. And he elected not to move it because he was already like 90 years old or so. And he moved up to Odeon Park. And then 129th Street west of Broadway became Sinclair Place, after Sinclair Pollock, who's buried behind Grant's tomb.
Thank you.
She was buried in Christ in St. Clair.
That's enough question.
So that's why, and it was also not uncommon, some 30 years before they started renaming a lot of the streets. 9th Avenue becomes,
Right.
Columbus and Millick Side. It's interesting when the subway opened. Actually, was I don't know if I know I scrolled by very quickly, but there was a postcard of the subway arch at 125th Street. It said, I don't know if you could make it out. It said Manhattan Viaduct,
Yeah.
because it opened as the Manhattan Street Station, which remained for 17 years until they changed the names. And Lawrence Street became 126th Street, what it is today.
Well, maybe we can all retire to some sandwiches and coffee and our books in the back.
Thanks in the back.
Thanks.